I asked, you delivered. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Future Redeemed, the titular, whatever that word means, DLC story for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has come and gone. The future awaited, the Rex was Chatosaurusing, and with it came a possible slew of hot takes from the community, my community. And I did a call to arms, people, to gather all these hot takes into one putrid cauldron of a comment section, so that I can don my gas mask, my salvager mask, and go down to the depths to determine what hot takes lie within my community. And I assembled, nay, like the Avengers, quite a few of these hot takes, so I say we just delve right on into this. And remember, keep it civil. I did ask for these specifically. We'll start off with a pair of hot takes because they both concern the character of Riku. We have Christian Castillo, who says we needed more Riku. That's a fact. Pair that with Tyler Hoff, who says, my hot take, Riku should have been the main character. Would have also liked to see what happened to Shulk and Rex's friends through dialogue or plot details. Also hot take number 2, doubling up here. The DLC for Xenoblade 3 is better than the base game, gameplay-wise and story-wise. Base Xenoblade 3 was a complete mess in my opinion. Class upgrades were not fun to level up. Okay, there's a lot to be said there, but let's start with the Riku idea. I wouldn't have been upset if Riku was the main character. Don't get me wrong, I love Matthew and all. I really wish he had a little bit more time in the sun. I feel that any critiques I have of Future Redeemed almost all go down to the fact that Future Redeemed is pretty short in its structure overall. And I imagined that Future Redeemed was going to cover somehow Riku getting Lucky 7 and then passing it along. I imagined that was going to be one of the main plot lines. It was more of a subplot, but it was there. And for the most part, Riku just kind of felt like he was there as, an upgrader, which was cool, but I did kind of want a little bit more for the character. Now, Future Redeemed being better than the base game, gameplay-wise, could be a bit polarizing. I like the customization more in Future Redeemed than the base game, and I like the overworld progression and collectibles in Future Redeemed over the base game. That's a personal thing. When it comes to story, though, I don't think Future Redeemed had a Chapter 5 for me. It had some great moments, but again, I wish there was a couple more chapters there. I had the same critique with Xenoblade 3, though. I wouldn't call Xenoblade 3 a complete mess, because I think Chapters 1 to the beginning half of Chapter 6 are some of the best content Xenoblade has ever produced. And I think there is some merit to the class structure from Xenoblade 3. And I liked its cyclical nature, where you unlock a class, you level it up for all your characters, and by the time you do that, you probably got a new class to start the cycle all over again, but you're building on top of the master arts and skills that you've accumulated up to that point, which forwards, player agency and customization. I like that element. You combine that with some kind of progression system from Future Redeemed, and I'm really thinking we're cooking there. Let's move on to Fred Breaker, who has a rather spicy take. The radio scene was the worst one in the DLC, and the connections to Xenosaga are bound to push some people away from the Xeno series as a whole because of how needlessly complicated they make the lore. I'm gonna push back on this for a couple of reasons. One, when I first played Future Redeemed, I did kind of agree that, hey, if you're gonna make Xenosaga this important to the lore, there should be some kind of easy way, an official way, to play the Saga games for people who only have played Xenoblade, which is a lot of people like me. However, you really don't need Saga. If you want to look at Xenoblade by itself, you have a perfectly good beginning, middle, and end. All the stuff that happens in Saga, sure, it could be important to what happens in Saga, but as it pertains to Xenoblade, it's really not. People find the conduit, or the Zohar, whatever you want to call it now. Klaus gets his hands on it, creates a new universe, then you have all of Blade, which you really do not need Saga for. In fact, look at the framing in which they have this scene with the radio, because it's very cleverly placed, where you can pay attention to the radio if you're a Saga fan to get all those references, or if you're not, you just pay attention to Niall and Matthew talking. And for the story that is important to Xenoblade by itself, you miss nothing. It's one of those things where, sure, you could read this as being complicated, but it really isn't as it pertains to Xenoblade. Like, you can argue the Siren Model Kit, but again, how is that lore pertinent or going to affect your perception of the Xenoblade story? If you played Xenoblade 1, Future Connected, 2, Torna, 3, Future Redeemed, that's a self-contained story. You do not need Saga for that story to work and to feel complete. Because I think there's a difference between a story working and a story feeling complete. Xenoblade, in my opinion, feels complete. Where if you have that saga lore, that backstory, sure, some gaps fill in, but you really don't need those gaps to begin with. And if you're not familiar with Saga, those gaps wouldn't even be known to you. My opinion is a bit of a case of people overthinking all the Saga lore because everybody who was a Saga fan was really hyping up Saga. And if you didn't play Saga, you just felt really left out as if you're missing a bunch of important plot points, when you really look at it, you're not really. Like, sure, they name dropped the villain from Saga. Who cares? Because if you're just looking at the Xenoblade story, it's really not important. Now, if it is important in Xenoblade 4, that's another thing. If they don't give us access to Saga, which I think they will, I'm personally of the opinion we're going to get a Xenosaga remaster or port or even a remake, something along those lines. I'm personally of that opinion. I'm not basing that off of anything. There's been no real reports for it, outside of we know Bandai Namco and Nintendo are doing something together, and that Saga or Xenosaga is in the intellectual properties page on the Nintendo Switch for Xenoblade 3 now, and that they thanked Bandai Namco in the credits of Future Redeemed. Outside of that, you really don't need Saga lore for Xenoblade to work. If I was never told about any of that Xenosaga stuff, heck, if you remove the radio section, nothing changes for the Xenoblade lore that's pertinent to Xenoblade. It's just extra in my opinion. Let's pivot over to the combat here, and Floating Mew comes in with swinging maybe. Starting a fight and having the enemy launch within seconds made the battle system boring. It made many fights against regular enemies laughably easy, and this may be my least favorite Xenoblade battle system as a result, which is a bold statement when Xenoblade 1 exists. I enjoyed Future Redeemed because I largely just played as Rex. I think every other character was way less interesting to play as, because they were just so agonizingly slow on the whole. But Rex, double spinning edge, at least I'm pressing something, right? So I can see why Future Redeemed would be someone's favorite combat system in Xenoblade. I can also see why it's someone's least favorite. I didn't personally mind launching enemies immediately. To me, it was a bit of a power trip. I kind of enjoyed that, but again, I can understand why some people didn't. Overall, my biggest critique for Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed's combat is mostly the lack of mechanics coming from enemies. There were a couple in Future Redeemed, like the end fight, for instance, or the Nile fight, where I actually had to pay attention to what the boss was doing instead of just the auto-attack damage. But for a short and condensed experience like Future Redeemed was, which is my exact same argument for Torna's combat, I think it worked for what we had. And I really liked the fact they leaned into customization and player agency in terms of customizing your characters and the combos that you could get from it. I really enjoyed that aspect. Let's move on to Fast, who says, the art we got for this DLC was the three swords, Noah, Shulk, and Rex. Even though Matthew was the descendant and was a great character, I would have really liked it to be an epilogue story instead of another prequel. I think Chapter 5 is the reason I'm glad Future Redeemed exists. To me, Future Redeemed feels like Chapters 1 to 4 serve as an excuse to justify Chapter 5. Because I think that final chapter is so strong story-wise and character-wise that it feels like Future Redeemed exists just to tell that one specific chapter. In terms of the grandiose overall arc, right? Because we had the character development of Rex and Shulk, with their children Glimmer and Nickel, sure. But really, to me, Future Redeemed feels like, hey, here's Chapter 5. Here's where we drop the hammer, where we slap it right onto the table. And yeah, I love Matthew as a character. He's full of beans. He's really fun. He's a great character who, in terms of character tropes, is up my alley. I like characters who aren't afraid to take action, and who have a little bit of confidence behind themselves. I like those types of characters, especially from main characters, and Matthew was basically what I liked out of that. Well, out of that trope. Having said that, yeah, having Noah, Shulk, and Rex, especially with that art, would have been nice. I kind of think we'll get something like that in Xenoblade 4. That might just be copium. I do think we'll see Noah again at least. But I still kind of attest to the idea that Xenoblade 3's story overall was about moving on from Ionios and moving into the future and not looking back, or not being stuck in the past. So doing a DLC story that's a prequel, going back to Ionios, feels kind of counterintuitive to that, and contradictory. I still hold to that. But I think there was also a nice message in Future Redeemed where it's like, okay, yeah, you have to move into the future, but you can't also forget the lessons of the past. I think there's some value to that. I like that aspect to it. But all Future Redeemed really did at the end of the day for me was make me want Xenoblade 4 even more. Or want some kind of follow-up to Xenoblade 3 in some capacity. Now, having said that, let's move on to Robbo's take from the Discord here, because this ties in very well with what we were just talking about. Hot take, I want Xenoblade 4 to cut all ties from the lore and characters of previous games, since I feel like Future Redeemed wrapped up the trilogy perfectly, and that any remaining plot points in future games would just be intrusions in the story Xeno 4 is trying to tell. I disagree with this 100%, so let's talk about it. Because to me, Xenoblade 1 and 2 wrapped up the story perfectly. There was no need to expand on any of those characters, those worlds, or stories after the end of Xenoblade 2. It was done, it was toasted, it was crispy. But then you come out with Xenoblade 3, and then you do that ending, where the worlds separate once again, and every other line of dialogue is someone saying, we'll see each other again, this is not the end. And even the song, during those off lines, is also saying, this goodbye is not the end. It's like they beat you over the head with this. And then they have that post-credits scene, where Noah walks into the distance after hearing the off-scene tune, and disappears for no freaking reason at that point in time. And then you get the Mio final save screen, where she says, I won't forget you until we can meet again, I promise. They end the game like that. And then in Future Redeemed, they have that post-credits scene of the world seemingly rejoining, or in my opinion, interlinking, all over again. If Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed was meant to be a capstone story, where those characters and worlds were never to be touched again, you would do that by just removing certain scenes. You would remove the post-credits scene from Xenoblade 3, and you would remove the post-credits scene from Future Redeemed as well. Those scenes exist, in my opinion, to tie them into Xenoblade 4 and to show, hey, there's something coming along here. Heck, even in Xenoblade 3 with Noah coming out of Ionios, all you do, if you do not want anyone to speculate that there's going to be a Xenoblade 4 and still maintain the story and the thematic ties of Xenoblade 3, all you do is you don't have the scene with him hearing the Agnian off-scene tune, or the off-scene tune in general, and disappearing. You just have him come out of Ionios and run off with Uni, Lands, and Urine to the fireworks. Job done. And then you don't have that final save screen either. That feels far more conclusive and closing the entire book instead of just flipping to the next chapter to me. And especially in Future Redeemed, a story that is entirely a prequel, there's no reason to show what happens to Ionios or the two worlds in the post-credit scene. You literally just do not have that scene, and it works functionally as a prequel. Those scenes were added with specific intent, in my opinion. So I fundamentally disagree with the notion or the idea that Xenoblade 3 wraps up these stories perfectly. To me, the entirety of Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed feel nothing more than set up to Xenoblade 4. They introduce new worldly concepts like light, being able to interact between these worlds. They establish the idea that you can communicate between these two worlds as well. They establish the notion of interlinking, and then they have the final scene from Future Redeemed where the worlds seemingly just interlink. And in the final boss fight, you defeat Alpha by having multiple characters, not just two, interlink together. So they establish that more than two people can interlink into one entity. And then they show a final credits scene where it's seemingly showing that two worlds themselves are interlinking together. That to me just feels like setup. And it feels like they're setting up notions and worldly mechanics to transition into a larger story, to establish something for the future. 100%. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. So let's move on to the next hot take, shall we? We have Kojo over here who says, I don't care that we don't get an explanation on how the Liberators are alive and somewhat young, even though N had multiple cycles before having great-grandchildren at the time of Future Redeemed. I don't care because Shulk made me really feeling it, and Rex's attitude was enough to make up for this unexplored plot point. Although it's a real shame that they don't really explain what Alvis did at the beginning of the game. For me, there's a difference between plot holes and things that just aren't all that important in the grand scheme of things that don't really need to be explained, in my opinion. And in my opinion, the timeline of how Shulk and Rex happened to meet up to be the Liberators, and how the exact timeline of when was Gondor born, how old are Rex and Shulk in the world of Ionios, Sure, could cool stories be told from that? Sure, but were they necessary for the story that we got? I don't think so, and I think the story we got made up for any of those possible plot holes. It's just not something I really focus on when I'm consuming a story. To me, it's one of those background details that doesn't really detract from the quality of the story that's being told on the display with Future Redeemed. So for me, I kind of just don't mind him. I'm along the same lines as Dole here, where the stuff that we got, I enjoyed so much, I didn't care really about the specifics about how we came to be with Shulk, Rex, and Matthew being in the same time in Ionios. I just kind of write it off as it's a quality of Ionios, Ionios is weird, a whole bunch of cycles, crap happens. I kind of write it off like that, and I'm content with that. We have Pata Parker here who says, even though I love Future Redeemed, I found it pretty weird that Rex didn't tell Glimmer that he's her father. Same thing with Shulk and Nickel. This one I'm far more in agreement with, compared to what I would normally classify as a hot take, because I'm not generally one to like long drawn out secrets like that. I would have personally preferred it if they said it flat out and told Nickel and Glimmer. I understand why they didn't, because in the context of Ionios, Nickel and Glimmer live their own lives, have no concept of what a family even is, and you could construe it as being not fair to Nickel and Glimmer to throw all of this knowledge from a world they don't know and expected them to treat you any differently. I kind of understand that point. At the same time, it would have been pretty freaking cool if it had a little subplot there. Maybe it's a victim because of the pacing of the game overall due to its brevity, because of how short the actual DLC was. But we had that one fight scene between Rex and Shulk, Glimmer and Nickel, which I thought was really cool, us fighting the protagonists from the first two games, helping to signify a new beginning for the series as a whole. I liked that element, and I thought the way that Rex and Shulk acted ordinarily, I got the story I wanted out of this relationship from those two, and this story may well be picked up again in Xenoblade 4 if they want to go that direction. So personally, I'm kind of fine with it, though I would have liked having a scene like that where they just come out, everything's out in the open, and be 100% honest. I normally like those types of scenes where a big secret's revealed, and even then we kind of got something similar with Shulk and Rex telling Matthew and everyone else about the true origins of Ionios. So I'm kind of here or there. And we ended off with Hummingbird, who says the final boss where Alvis hits the Yoinky Sploinky and Vine rises from the dead and interlinks with Riku to take back the crown of Yoinky Sploinky King was masterfully done. And honestly, I feel like this is a hard take because there was no Zeke involved whatsoever with this scene, and honestly, it just makes Future Redeemed a 0 out of 10 for me. Honestly, it's an unforgivable mortal sin that I don't think any amount of divine intervention could possibly rectify. This will be known as one of the biggest missteps in gaming history, and I'm sure we'll get an internet historian video at some point in about 2 years on this very, I would call it a drama, but a drama seems like a gross understatement, an under-exaggeration of the true gravitas of the scene that we were forced to witness. How do you only have Ryan hit the Yoinky Sploinky? How is Zeke not there as well? We demand answers, Monolith, yeah? I'm watching you. From the confines of a YouTube channel, I'll make a strongly wooded YouTube video, I'll let you know, yeah? Jokes aside though, thank you all for tuning in, my pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games if you can, and as always, hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload in the future, and subscribe, because on Saturday, June 3rd, we have episode 1 of the Chronicles of Xenoblade. My entire breakdown of the Xenoblade Chronicles series begins on Saturday. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe. I hope to see you all again next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.